Imagine it's almost midnight in Osaka. The last trains have already left the station, and the streets are beginning to empty. Four university students wander through the neon-lit back streets, laughing about where to spend the rest of the night. One of them suddenly points toward an ordinary-looking building. Let's stay there. You expect a cheap business hotel. Instead, they walk into a love hotel. Not one of them is on a date. One is carrying a birthday cake. Another has a shopping bag full of snacks. Someone is arguing over which movie to watch. 10 minutes later, they're singing karaoke in a room with a giant projector, soaking in a jacuzzi, and planning to stay until the first morning train. As strange as that sounds, it's becoming surprisingly common. Love hotels were built for one purpose: giving couples a private place to be alone. So why are so many of them now filled with groups of friends instead? And more importantly, how did an entire industry built around romance quietly reinvent itself without most people noticing? By the end of this video, you'll understand why this change has almost nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with how people reshape businesses to solve completely different problems than they were originally built for. Before we go any further, let's clear up one thing. If you've never been to Japan, the phrase love hotel probably sounds far more scandalous than it really is. Yes, these hotels are famous for offering couples privacy, but that's only part of the story. Think of them less as ordinary hotels and more like private rooms that people rent for a few hours or overnight. Unlike a typical hotel, many rooms come with oversized TVs, karaoke systems, massage chairs, jacuzzis, elaborate themed interiors, and complete privacy. Many guests never even speak to a receptionist. They simply choose a room from a touchscreen, pay, and head upstairs. For decades, everyone knew exactly who these hotels were designed for: couples. That was their identity, which is exactly why what's happening today is so unexpected. Walk through entertainment districts in cities like Osaka or Tokyo late at night, and you'll still see couples checking in. But you'll also see something that would have seemed unusual 20 years ago. Groups of university students, female friends celebrating birthdays, office coworkers continuing a night out, budget travelers, even solo guests looking for a comfortable place to rest for a few hours. Some hotels have stopped hiding this shift altogether. Instead of advertising romantic stays, they're promoting party plans, girls' nights, movie rooms, and karaoke packages. Some have redesigned rooms with multiple beds specifically for groups. Others advertise giant screens for watching concerts or sports together. At first glance, this feels like a business that somehow forgot what it was built for. But that's not what happened. The real story is much more interesting, because these hotels didn't abandon their original purpose. People simply discovered that the same building solved another problem just as well. And once that happened, everything began to change. You might think the obvious explanation is price. After all, splitting one large room between four friends is often cheaper than booking several hotel rooms. That's true, but it's also incomplete. If lower prices were the only reason, regular hotels would have adapted years ago. Instead, something else made love hotels uniquely attractive. Imagine it's 1 a.m, restaurants are closing, most cafes are no longer open. The last train has already left. Someone's apartment is far too small for 4 or 5 people. Nobody wants to spend hundreds of dollars on taxis. Now compare two options. A standard hotel gives you beds, a love hotel gives you beds, plus karaoke, a huge television, a private jacuzzi, room service, complete privacy, and the freedom to laugh until sunrise without worrying about disturbing neighbors. Suddenly the question isn't, why would friends use a love hotel? The better question is, why wouldn't they? That tiny shift in perspective changes everything, because once you stop thinking of these places as hotels for romance, they start looking more like private entertainment spaces that just happen to have beds. And that's exactly how thousands of young people in Japan have quietly begun using them. But here's the part that surprised me the most. This transformation didn't happen because somebody invented a new business. It happened because an old business slowly became useful for something nobody originally planned. The buildings barely changed, many of the rooms barely changed, even the laws governing them barely changed. The people changed, their lifestyles changed, their housing changed, the way they socialized changed, and those small cultural shifts ended up transforming an entire industry, which raises a much bigger question. If love hotels weren't originally created for groups of friends, then why were they created in the first place? To answer that, We have to go back to a very different Japan, a country rebuilding itself after one of the most devastating wars in history. To understand why love hotels exist at all, you first have to imagine what everyday life in Japan looked like after World War II. The country wasn't just rebuilding its economy, it was rebuilding millions of lives. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed by bombing. Housing was desperately scarce, and the homes that remained were often shared by several generations of the same family. Parents, grandparents, children. Sometimes everyone lived under the same roof. Space wasn't simply expensive, it barely existed. For many young couples, privacy wasn't something you could buy. It simply didn't exist at home. Even married couples often found themselves living with relatives, separated from everyone else by little more than a thin sliding door. Today, it's easy to think of privacy as a personal preference. Back then, it was a luxury. And whenever society creates a problem that millions of people share, someone usually finds a business opportunity hiding inside it. Long before anyone called them love hotels, small inns began quietly filling that gap. They were known as shurikomi yado, a phrase that roughly translates to bring along inns. The name wasn't particularly romantic, it was practical. Bring someone with you, rent a room, leave when you're finished. No questions, no paperwork, no awkward conversations. These weren't glamorous places. Most were small, inexpensive, and forgettable. But they offered something almost impossible to find anywhere else. A private room for a few hours. That simple idea turned out to be incredibly valuable. Not because it encouraged scandal, but because it solved a problem ordinary housing couldn't. And that's an important distinction. Many people outside Japan assume these businesses were created primarily for sex. History suggests something more complicated. They were created because privacy itself had become scarce. Romance simply happened to be one of the reasons people needed it. Around the same time, another piece of the puzzle quietly fell into place. In 1956, Japan passed the Anti-Prostitution Law. At first glance, that sounds like the kind of law that would destroy businesses built around private rooms. Instead, it did almost the opposite. Here's why. The law targeted prostitution itself. It targeted solicitation. It targeted organized prostitution businesses. What it did not outlaw was renting someone a private room. That might sound like a tiny legal distinction. In reality, it changed everything. Because a hotel doesn't control what two consenting adults do after closing the door. Legally speaking, it was providing accommodation, nothing more. That difference between what the law prohibited and what it simply didn't regulate created an enormous gray area. Not a loophole hidden in fine print, a boundary. And businesses quickly learned how to operate inside it. It's a pattern you'll see again and again throughout history. Laws are usually written to stop one specific behavior. People, meanwhile, become remarkably creative at finding perfectly legal ways to accomplish something similar without technically breaking those rules. Love hotels became one of the clearest examples of that idea. By the 1960s, those modest inns began transforming into something completely different. Competition grew, Japan's economy was booming, businesses no longer needed to offer only privacy, now they had to offer experiences. One hotel in Osaka adopted a name that would eventually become famous across the entire country: Love Hotel. It was a surprisingly simple piece of branding, but it worked. Soon other businesses followed, and once they started competing with one another, things became wonderfully strange. Instead of plain rooms, there were castles, pirate ships, European palaces, space stations, jungles. Some rooms looked like movie sets, others looked like amusement parks. Rotating beds appeared, mirrored ceilings, built-in karaoke systems, jacuzzis, lighting that changed colors at the push of a button. Scholar Kim Ik-yeon, who has extensively researched the history of love hotels, describes this period as the industry's transformation from a practical service into a form of entertainment. Privacy was still the product, but spectacle had become the marketing. By the 1980s and 1990s, visiting a love hotel had become almost a cultural ritual for many young couples. It wasn't necessarily something people proudly talked about with their parents, but neither was it some shocking underground secret. For many relationships, it was simply part of growing up. The hotels reflected the optimism of Japan's economic boom. They became bigger, more elaborate, more luxurious, and for a while, it looked like the industry's future was completely secure. If someone had predicted back then that one day groups of college friends would become some of its most enthusiastic customers, almost nobody would have believed them, because nothing about these buildings suggested they would ever become anything other than places for romance. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Not because the hotels suddenly changed, but because Japan itself did. And that change began somewhere far beyond the walls of any love hotel. It began inside the homes people were living in. I'm Mr. Orange. If you want to keep discovering stories like this, hit follow so you don't miss the next one. And if there's a topic you're curious about, drop it in the comments. I might make the next video about it.